This is the word of the Lord.
It's so lovely to have the sound of young voices again. It's so nice to have them here. And I hope you're coping with it's a bit, rowdier than normal, but we love having them. So, and thank you, Peter, for reading from the message. It's a very nice way of telling this very simple tale of two extraordinary women, and in due course, a very faithful man. And I just want to reflect with you for a little while about some of the details of this story. It was in the days of the judges, and there was some social infrastructure in Israel amongst the tribes, but it wasn't a developed kingdom as such at this stage. There was rudimentary kind of ideas of how to look after each other. There did exist some social conventions written into the most basic laws of Moses, designed to ensure the ongoing viability of even the most destitute in the land. So things like the gleaning laws, where you could go to any field and the edges of the field should not be harvested by the person who owns the field, but there should be some grain left there for people who had no other means. This was a very rudimentary social security system, if you like. But these conventions were not as developed or as universally reliable as some of the social security systems that we might have seen in Australia in recent generations. Should you fall on hard times, it was really the kindness of the wealthy that was your main hope. But when famine hit the whole land, food security itself becomes an issue, and it doesn't matter how wealthy you are, it affects everybody. So Elimelech and Naomi make the survival discernment to leave their homeland in search for food. And I think it's pretty difficult for people my age and younger who've lived in Australia, for example, to have any real sense of how frightening this sense of desperation would have been. This situation, I don't know about you, but I've never missed out or feared missing out on the food I needed. When I was younger, due to the cost of meat and my parents' household budget, my parents made the choice to go without meat so that my sister and my brother and I could have meat, because they couldn't afford to feed everybody, so they went without the meat and gave that to us kids. So I've been the beneficiary of my parents' sacrificial generosity in a way. And when Joe and I were first married, we both had very low-wage jobs, and we experienced that humiliation of going through the supermarket checkout and getting to the end and finding out there wasn't enough money in the account to pay for what we'd got. So we'd withdraw things until the bank would approve the thing. That's an awful experience. And then you have to go and put them back on the shelves. You have to work out on the spot while the queue gets longer behind you, what do we actually really need and what was this week's kind of extra. But we never feared not having enough food. Like, we knew that if it even got more desperate, we could always rely on our families. They were there, they had resources. And even if they weren't there were charity services. You can get a meal in Sydney, if you really want one, for free any day of the week. But when famine hit Israel, there would have been some privately owned silos around, I'm sure, but even those with a lot become very careful when it's not clear how long it might be until the next harvest arrives. And so this was a very desperate time. So the famine sends Elimelech and Naomi and their two sons to the foreign land of Moab. And for this young family, there was no grand plan, no awareness that they were about to be written into the history of the people of Israel. Life simply threw them famine and hardship at them and at the whole nation. And Elimelech and Naomi made the wisest and most faithful response they could to the challenges they were facing. You've got to love the enthusiasm, right? Now, we do get a window into the sense of connection that Naomi, at least, lived with in relation to her God. Because she says, this whole thing, he says to her daughters, I think, this whole thing is harder for me than for you, for the hand of the Lord has gone forth against me. Again, we heard this in Job, didn't we? We see the seemingly unavoidable blame people lay on God for those big life circumstances that are no one else's fault, which ends up rebounding onto ourselves as somehow deserving the hardship. And we can hear an echo of that in Naomi's cry there. Because, make no mistake, things were really bleak for Naomi. In those days, livelihood depended on hard physical labour. This is the age before computers, right? The age before fossil-fuelled machines, and even the age before many elaborate tools. To lose one's husband in this context was to lose not simply your financial security, but your very viability as a woman, or a person if you're a woman. Women had so little status in the ancient culture, rather than being allowed to own property, which they weren't, they were considered as property themselves. They were owned by their men. A woman was recognised essentially according to the man she was connected to. But as a widow with 2 sons, Naomi still had some hope. Her sons would take care of her. And that was a cultural expectation of the day. And that was the effective social security system in a sense. So when Naomi then loses her 2 sons as well, it is little wonder that Naomi declares, the hand of the Lord is against me. It's as though this is the last straw. No parent wants to bury their own child. Children are meant to be the up and coming generation. They live beyond us. They don't die before us. To bury both of her sons was indeed a devastating blow for Naomi. But it would seem that Naomi handles her situation with courage and grace. A number of us are currently negotiating the process of caring for elderly parents as they navigate the less independent phase of their life. Now, setting aside the various challenges this poses for adult children caring for elderly parents, we at least have comprehensive support services and structures in our culture. These support services may not be as good as we would like them to be. They may not always be delivered in the most timely manner. I think my mum's ACAT package comes in about 9 to 12 months. But they are available. And there are services out there. But in Naomi's day, no such services existed. Your family were your aged care service. And that meant the generation younger than you took on the responsibility of ensuring you were cared for as you re-entered a state of being dependent again. Naomi's daughters-in-law seem ready to take on that cultural expectation. They look after their mother-in-law, into her old age. But Naomi does not want to burden them with that responsibility. She knew that to drag these 2 Moabite women with her back to Israel would be to sentence them very likely to a very long widowhood without any means of support for them when they got older. The daughters-in-law would be perpetual outsiders in Israel, with no one to protect them into their old age. Naomi, at least, had lived much of her life already. It hadn't been a life full of champagne and glitter, but perhaps she would find some form of refuge among her people back in her home in Israel. So as a result, Naomi was prepared to go by herself on this treacherous journey back alone. I still remember the first time I travelled alone internationally. I was already in my mid-20s. I was a fairly sheltered mid-20s, but I was only heading across the ditch to New Zealand to check out a Bible college over there. People I knew here in Australia had set it up so that members of the college staff would meet me at the airport, and I would go with them to the college and stay in their home, and they would feed me and take me to classes in the college and show me around. And in short, there was no risk. I was going to be extremely well looked after, and there was nothing to worry about. And yet I was very anxious. I didn't know what I was going to face when I got there. I can't begin to imagine how Naomi must have felt. The journey itself would have been dangerous enough, but not having a place to stay prepared beforehand would be an added risk on arrival. Yes, you could hopefully, at least initially, rely on Middle Eastern cultural hospitality where people did get invited in for a day or so into someone's home, but she had very little means of support and no prospects. Naomi was entrusting herself into the hands of God. This God she kind of felt had dealt so harshly with her. Ruth would not have it. She would not see her mother-in-law wander off alone into the wilderness. All that Naomi had said to Ruth and to her sister made very good sense. Orpah was not stupid to take the opportunity to be released from these familial obligations. This did represent the best opportunity of a life and a livelihood going forward for these two young women. Stay in Moab, find another husband, get a life. Don't go back to a foreign land where there was probably no prospect for you. And the text does not tell us in detail how Ruth weighed this situation. It simply declares the fierce loyalty between Ruth and her mother-in-law Naomi. And in a way, Ruth likewise entrusted herself to God. She did so in effect by entrusting herself to her mother-in-law. It's as though Ruth is saying to Naomi, if it's good enough for you, it's good enough for me. Now, neither of the women knew what lay ahead for them. You'd have to say prospects were not good for either of them. They had both encountered so much grief, distress, and hardship. It would be understandable if they'd simply folded their arms and sat down and given up altogether. And here, I think, is the essence of hope. To keep going with an eye to things getting better. I was not yet here at Mustard Seed when Leanne had entered her battle with cancer. I can only imagine how frightening that must have been, all the unknowables that lay ahead at that moment, the unenviable journey of treatment, the ongoing risk management that's always required, and Leanne and Ian had to learn to navigate those things together. And I don't doubt that there were times when they became exhausted and frightened and confused and possibly even felt like they might be defeated by the challenge that they were facing. And yet when I observe Ian and Leanne today, I don't see a couple of staggering survivors. I see two vibrant, creative, life-loving contributors who strengthen our community and build up the body of Christ. They did not fold their arms and give up hope. They kept walking. They live their hope and they live out their faith in vulnerable trust in the face of the unknown. And I'm also aware there are more stories of a similar nature of people sitting in this room this morning. Some are still too tender to speak of publicly at this time. But when a person has been through the kind of life challenges that Naomi and Ruth faced, this kind of lived hope is a profound expression of faith. It's one thing to say, I believe this or I believe that, but when a person's life displays this strength of hope, it matters less what they say because we can see their faith in the way they continue to engage their journey, engage their life, and continue to contribute to others through their life. As we remember and reflect on the lives of Naomi and Ruth, and we're going to talk more about this next week, many 1,000 years on from the time when the events happen, we might wonder what anyone in 1,000 years from now might remember and reflect on concerning our lives. And you know what? We can't possibly know. Just as Naomi and Ruth Naomi and Ruth would come to the end of their lives never knowing about King David. They were not self-consciously aware of their part in the history of the people, the crucial part they were playing in the unfolding history of God's people. In a moment, we're going to remember and reflect on the supreme act of self-giving love and hope that Jesus offered when he died on the cross for us, and he tells us to remember as we gather around the Lord's table. Naomi's self-giving faithfulness, in a sense, is a precursor of the Messiah who would arrive in Israel many generations after Naomi. After Naomi, but notably in the family line to which Naomi is now instrumental in this story. May we allow these life-giving witnesses to always spur us on to love others and live out our faith in life-giving ways, even when the precise consequences of our faithfulness are beyond our capacity to know, because that is what faith is. To the glory of Christ. Amen.